I'm Dr. Natalie Scala. I am at Towson University. I teach mostly in the business school a subject called analytics. So I'm an associate professor there, and I also direct our graduate program in supply chain management. So the title of this talk today for Cybersecurity Month is Keeping Our Elections Secure. So what we're doing at Towson is myself and some other professors and a bunch of students have been doing ongoing research on election security. And like I mentioned a second ago, I teach analytics. So we use analytics, which are a form of applied math, to figure out how to keep elections as secure as possible. And what we're trying to do is calculate risk. And then we want to design mitigations to prevent risk. So we want to figure out basically what are all the things that could go wrong, what is the chance of those things going wrong? And then how do we prevent them from going wrong, especially for the things that have the highest chance of occurring? So we've been focusing on polling places for about 3 years. And then recently we also started looking at mail-based voting. So our overall goal is to understand how we're working to secure elections. And I want to motivate Americans to vote. So that's what I hope you get out of this presentation today and this classroom assignment. Get an understanding of how we're keeping elections secure, especially in Maryland. And then hopefully that'll motivate you if you're eligible to vote, or your parents or your friends or other people in your circles to go ahead and vote. All right, so first poll question would be a little bit of voting history. And do you know what this picture is on the screen? Yes, no, maybe. So this actually is a punch card. So this is a very old form of computer input, but this is how people voted a few years ago, basically before 2000. And they would push the card into their election booth, and then every single candidate had a number associated with them on the ballot. And then they had a little tiny pin that looked like a safety pin, and they would punch the holes above the number for the candidate that they wanted to vote for. And this went on for decades. People voted like this in America for decades. But in 2000, we had an issue with the presidential election with Bush versus Gore. And what happened is that in some of the punch cards, the hole did not go, the punch did not go all the way through the hole. And then the little piece of paper that was supposed to fall out of the card sometimes was hanging on the back, sometimes it was sort of there, sometimes it wasn't fully punched. And then there was a question of, well, who did that person really want to vote for? Did they start voting and then stop, or did they really mean to punch it all the way through? So there was a lot of confusion, especially in the state of Florida around that election. And that led to the motivation of something called the Help America Vote Act, which was passed by Congress in 2002. And that was sweeping reforms to voting processes. And that pretty much ended punch cards in the United States. It moved to changing voting systems to be electronic based or computer based, and also helped to increase voter access in America. So things were working pretty well. We didn't really think about using electronic equipment until the 2016 election. And then there was all this talk in the media and all this research that maybe a foreign actor tried to interfere in the election. And we don't, what do we mean by interfere? So a lot of the stuff that's being talked about right now is social media posts that may or may not be true, amplifying the kind of the discord in the country, and more of like a discussion based or a narrative, versus per se an actual election being targeted or hacked. But after the 2016 election, the Department of Homeland Security revealed in 2017 that 21 states were targets of attacks during the 2016 presidential election. So some foreign actor or a hacker or somebody somewhere tried to target the state's election equipment in some way. Now, that's targeted, which means they tried, but we don't have evidence that it was actually successful, that they got into that equipment and tried to compromise it. And then in 2019, just last year, the Senate Intelligence Committee concluded that actually the election systems in every single state in the US were targeted in some form in 2016. And then Special Counsel Mueller testified in 2019 that this interference is ongoing. So again, the interference can be like a social media discourse kind of thing, but it could also be some sort of targeting to systems. So what we look at in this research is, well, what about this whole idea about the systems targeting? And, what about that? And honestly, as, American voters sometimes, some of this kind of to me even seems like a little bit removed, right? I'm kind of like this, all this stuff is going on, but what does that mean? And how does that impact me? So what we specifically look at Towson in this research is how do we ensure the votes of the typical American, just like you and me, those votes have integrity. And what we mean by integrity is that it's counted the way you cast it. So even going back to those punch cards, those votes needed to be counted in 2000, the way they were cast and the way they were punched and how the voter intended it to. We're thinking of the same thing in just this electronic based environment. We want your vote counted the way you cast it, no matter who you voted for, whatever candidate you chose. So to do this, we specifically focus on polling places. And we kind of take those for granted in the United States. We go to polling places to vote typically. It's a little different this year with COVID-19, but still people do go to polling places to vote. But typically in an election, there's precincts across the state. You go to a specific designated place to vote. And things go as normal, or they appear to go as normal every single time you go or your family goes. So we sort of take them for granted, but they're definitely a key part of keeping votes secure because they're where the public interacts with the voting process. The public isn't there in Annapolis where the votes are, tabulated and final counted. The public really isn't there in some of the other pieces. I mean, there's watchdogs and, ways to check it, but we're not actually physically there. We're physically go to vote at a polling place. And, after COVID-19, we kind of stopped thinking about polling places and we got really, really focused on how to, even conduct election with mail-based voting and things like that. So polling places are important. And one of the examples that we like to talk about a lot is it's kind of like if you go to the mall. So let's say I go to the mall and I go to Macy's and the store is really neat and spread out nicely and everything is orderly and clean and the fitting rooms are nice and orderly. And I feel great about Macy's, right? The associates who help me are nice, they're friendly, they're helping me find my product. I feel great about Macy's. I'm going to come back to Macy's. But let's say I go to Macy's in a different mall and it's just a bad experience. The fitting rooms are full of old clothes. It's, the paint, they need a new coat of paint. The floor is dirty. I'm not going to feel great about Macy's if I go in those types of scenarios, and I may not go back. Same kind of thing with polling place. If I feel good there and I know that things are going well and I have confidence, I'm going to come back and I'm going to keep voting. So that's what we're trying to get at. So another poll question, how Americans vote. Are elections carried out the same way in every state? So yes or no? So we'll give that a second. Okay, so the correct answer here is no, and that is due to our separation of powers. States have control over elections. So the federal government actually does not run the election. Congress can give states money to run the elections. The Department of Homeland Security, which is at the federal level, can provide guidance, meaning helping states secure what they're doing. But the actual running of the elections and printing of the ballots and counting them and setting up the polling places and setting up all the rules in that state are up to the state legislatures and state powers. So because they're up to the states, everybody does their own thing. So it's not necessarily the same way in every single state. And because of that, there's different types of voting machines. So like I said, with 2002 Help America Vote Act, we moved all to electronic based voting across the country. And there's different kinds of machines that different states chose to use. So on the left, we see this kind of machine here where you put this little credit card in above this square red button with 2 dots on top of it. You put this credit card type thing in there, and it actually looks like a credit card with a chip on it. You plug it in, you touch screen and choose your candidates, or you use the buttons on the side down the 2 columns to choose your candidate. Your votes are stored on the credit card. You pull the card out, you hand the card in to vote. All your votes are recorded on the card, you turn that in. On the right-hand side, this is what we're using in Maryland. You get a big paper ballot, you fill in the circles for who you would like to vote for, and then you feed that ballot through what they call an optical scanner. Optical meaning it's light using to look to see what bubbles you chose. And then it's going to scan your vote and count it at the machine, and then the ballot's going to drop in a box underneath. Optical scanners are some of the most secure voting equipment that we have in the US, and that's mostly because this paper trail is here. The ballot falls in a box underneath the scanner. So in the worst case scenario, if something would happen and the little disc or the thumb drive that they're recording the votes on, or the power would go out or something, we still have the paper ballots we can go and hand check and mark off the winner. Or sorry, mark off the counting of the votes. The one with the credit card is a little bit harder to track because there's no paper trail. So if something would go wrong, we just have the credit card type files to look at. We don't have a paper trail. Now, there is some electronic based voting in Maryland as well. Some of equipment that's kind of a variant of this is used as well. And that's especially used with our disabled access voters. It reads screens, it helps them understand if they are vision impaired or other things. All Marylanders can choose to use electronic equipment if they prefer. There's also a lot of optical scanners at in-person voting stations. So based on the type of equipment we have and based on what's going on too, there are different kinds of threats to the election. So one of the things that we've done from an academic research perspective that is new and novel, what we call novel, is we define threat in 3 different ways. So a lot of the stuff that people talk about in terms of potential threats to elections are cyber-based threats, hacking, online behaviors. But there's also something called physical threats and insider threats. So cyber threats are digital machines, media, the voting equipment itself, equipment we use to tabulate votes, all that kind of stuff, whether or not it's connected to the internet or not, just where there is some sort of digital electronic component to it. Physical threats have to do with actually tampering or disrupting different equipment. So that can happen a lot when we see tampering in terms of, so basically they set up election equipment the night before, for example, and early voting is going on at the time we're recording this in Maryland. So we're recording this about a week before the election. So early voting is happening. They set up the equipment. They're going to use it for a few days. So they actually leave it set up overnight and just lock the buildings, but they put tape on things. And the goal is that if somebody would come in and mess with the equipment overnight, they would see that the tape is damaged or ripped. And that would be an indicator that something happened. And then insider threats. Insider threats are interesting. These are people-based threats. These are when a person becomes a threat to the election process. And there's 2 ways to have insider threats. The first one is that people just make simple, honest mistakes. So we could have poll workers or voters come into a polling place and try and vote or try and help someone to vote, and they make a mistake. They, give them the wrong ballot, the one for maybe a different county and not theirs. They do some sort of mistake, but that disrupts the process and, leads to things going wrong. Insiders could also be someone who has a nefarious intent or is adversarial. So adversarial means that they don't like us. So deliberate actions trying to make harm and with the intent to disrupt the process. So what we do is we look at all 3 types of threats and we define and we look at where do those threats come from. So they can be cyber, physical, or insider. And here are some of the things that could go wrong at polling places. Now, the nice thing about Maryland is that Maryland has a pretty secure voting process to begin with. And we don't have any evidence that any of these things have ever been compromised in an election in Maryland. But we obviously don't want that to happen and we don't want that to start. So we're trying to look at all these different sources of threat or inputs of threat and identify where things could come from. So these sources, these are what you're seeing on the screen are called influence diagrams. The yellow block in the center that says cyber, physical, or insider are the actual what we call goal or what we're trying to measure. And then the lighter shaded blocks around it with the lines feeding into the center are all sources or inputs. These are all factors or forces or things that could go wrong. So a lot of equipment in Maryland is electronic. People check in on something called a poll book. They give their name to the poll worker, and then they look it up in an online database and they mark that they're here to vote. And then, of course, we have the scanning machine as well when you scan the ballot. And then we have the electronic voting equipment that some people use as well. All right, so who are the people at the polling place? We have poll workers and we have voters, and the poll workers especially are insiders. So what we call in cybersecurity trusted insiders are people who have access to equipment or access to a network, and we trust that they're not going to do anything wrong. And again, most people don't want to do anything wrong. They're not there to cause a problem, but sometimes their mistakes can lead to a problem. So, for example, another mistake is if you go to a job, let's say, and you have different cubicles set up and everybody has their own cubicle desk with a computer at it. You step up because you want to, walk away from your desk to go to lunch, for say. You have to lock your computer, turn the password on, lock your screen when you walk away, because otherwise somebody could come sit down at your computer, pretend they're you, and send a really nasty email to your boss, for example, and sign your name even though it wasn't you. So we have to make sure when we're trusted insiders, we trust that the people who are inside the process or have access to the equipment aren't going to do anything wrong. And like I said, most people don't want to do anything wrong, but we just got to make sure those mistakes, like not walking away without your password locked, we want to make sure those mistakes don't happen.